Countless numbers among them welcomed the chance at battlefield booty, to feast on American rations, to smoke cigarettes with real tobacco in them. A choice between camels and Chesterfields, to get a pair of the good leather boots the army wore. Others welcomed retribution, a chance to pay back the army for the destruction of German cities, for the bombing of civilians, to chase him forever from German soil. In the SS Panzer divisions, morale was highest of all. Noted one SS trooper to his sister, "I write during one of the great hours before we attack, full of expectation for what the next days will bring. Everyone who has been here the last 2 days and nights, who has witnessed hour after hour the assembly of our crack divisions, who has heard the constant rattling of panzers, knows that something is due. We attack and will throw the enemy from our homeland. That is a holy task." On the back of the envelope, he scribbled, "Ruth, Ruth, Ruth, we march." A member of an old Virginia family, Walter Melville Robertson, had received a commission in the infantry from West Point in 1912. Seeing no overseas duty during World War I, he served the usual between wars assignments, mostly with infantry regiments at isolated U.S. posts in the West and Southwest, but he also served as an instructor at the Command and General Staff College and at the Army War College. Early in 1940, he went to Fort Sam Houston, just outside San Antonio, Texas, to join one of the U.S. Army's more renowned regular units, the 2D Infantry Division, with which Robertson's destiny was long to be linked. Possibly because he and his wife had no children, the 2D Division became a kind of family to him. Mild-mannered and soft-spoken, he had the reddish hair and florid complexion of an Irishman, and also a temper when tested too far. No drinker, something of a loner, he seldom mingled socially with his officers, but they had deep respect for his ability as a commander. Robertson first commanded a battalion in the 9th Infantry, then the regiment itself, then the 23D Infantry, whereupon he became assistant division commander, and finally assumed command of the division. Under his command, the 2D Division came ashore on Omaha Beach the day after D-Day. At 56, Robertson was a few years older than most division commanders. When at the end of the first week of December, Robertson went to headquarters of the Fee Corps in Eupen to receive the order for the attack on the Roa River dams, one aspect of the plan of attack troubled him deeply. Approaching the dams from the south, he would have at first only one road over which the entire division would have to advance and also depend upon for supply. It ran from the town of Bullingen north through Crinkelt and Rocherath, 2 villages so close together that they appeared to be one, thence for 6 miles through a dense fir forest to the first objective, a road junction known as Wallerscheid, and marked by a customs house, a farmhouse, concrete dragon's teeth, and a thick cluster of pillboxes of the west wall. The enemy strongpoint sat astride one of the wide gaps in the defensive line of the 99th Division. For almost the entire distance, the road ran behind and almost parallel with the 99th Division's positions along the German frontier from 1 to 3 miles away. If the Germans should penetrate the 99th Division's extended line and cut the road at any point along the 9 miles from Bullingen to Wallerscheid, whatever portion of Robertson's troops had passed over the road would be trapped. There would be no way out except on foot, for there was not even a trail leading westward except for a dirt track from Crinkelt-Rocherath through the village of Würzfeld, thence over a meandering course to the town of Elsenborn, and for more than half a mile the track ran along a stream bottom with soil of such consistency that not even a jeep could negotiate it. Once troops of the 106th Division began to take over on the Schnee Eifel, Robertson's engineer officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert W. Warren, put his 2D Engineer Battalion to work to improve that track to make it passable at least for one-way traffic. Yet that would merely alleviate Robertson's problem, not solve it, for the track through Würzfeld was near the start of what would be the division's lone supply route, so that a cut along the wooded 6-mile stretch north of Crinkelt-Rocherath might still trap the division. So, too, would an enemy thrust into Crinkelt-Rocherath, and there were 2 fairly good roads leading into the twin villages through frontier forests from German positions. A heavy snowstorm was pelting the northern reaches of the Ardennes and the Eifel when Robertson's troops began to move from the Schnee Eifel region to assembly areas in and near a Belgian army caserne close behind the 99th Division's front, Camp Elsenborn. In an effort to achieve surprise, There was no patrolling to pinpoint the enemy's defences before the troops of the leading 9th Infantry began to march north from crinkled Rocherath into the fir forest soon after daylight on December 13th. There was at first no enemy, but the going was slow. Although the storm had passed, warming weather made the snow heavy, and because the road was known to be mined and at intervals blocked by felled trees, the men had to plough through the forest on either side, sometimes grappling through growths of wet young firs, at other times subjected to falling snow from towering branches of the bigger ones. By the time the column neared the enemy-held road junction around noon, everybody was drenched. The hope for surprise quickly vanished. 100 yards in front of the pillboxes, the forest cover ran out, and the first men to emerge from the woods line drew a blast of fire from rifles and automatic weapons, while mortar and artillery shells exploded in the treetops and threw a lethal shower of fragments onto the forest floor. In some places, rows of barbed wire entanglements 6 to 10 deep barred the way to the pillboxes, and the snow hid a veritable quilt of deadly anti-personnel mines. That first day, the men of the 9th Infantry made not a dent in the German position, and night brought with it a numbing cold that froze the men's wet uniforms almost stiff. Through the night, patrols probed without success to try to find a weak spot in the defences, while most of the men tried to keep warm by painfully etching some kind of cover from the frozen earth. It was a miserable pattern that would be long repeated, and all the while medical jeeps formed a steady procession back down the forest road, laboriously swept of mines by the engineers. Meanwhile, a few hundred yards to the southeast of Wallerscheid, 3 of the 99th Division's battalions attacked down into deep ravines and up precipitous wooded hillsides in an effort to pin down other enemy troops and prevent them from reinforcing at Wallerscheid or pushing through the forest to cut the lone supply route. In almost every case on the first day, German fire stopped those men too, and the cold night was just as painful for them as for the men of the 2D Division. Over the next 2 days, those men nevertheless wrenched gains of a few hundred yards from the stubborn defenders and the hostile forest. Several miles to the north, beyond Monschau, an untried infantry division, the 78th, attacked southeastward in support of the 2D Division's attack over rolling open ground, dotted with villages and pillboxes, the northern prong of what the corps commander, General Gero, hoped would become a double envelopment converging on the dams. Gains were painfully slow, but one battalion managed on the first day to advance 1.5 miles to seize 2 villages, and on the next, a company slipped past defended pillboxes to take a third. Then the Germans began to counterattack. By late afternoon of the third day, the company in the forward village still held, but its position was precarious, and after nightfall, a prisoner provided the disturbing news that a previously unidentified 326th Volksgrenadier Division was assembled nearby. Back at Wallerscheid, as dusk approached on the second day, December 14, 10 men slithered unnoticed by the Germans under one barbed wire entanglement after another until all the rows were behind them, and in their wake other men cut a 4-foot gap through the wire. Yet the men had no communications with their company headquarters, where some confusion existed because the company commander had just been wounded and evacuated. The men of the patrol had long since retired before word of what they had accomplished reached the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Walter M. Higgins, Jr. When the next night came December 15th, and the 9th Infantry was as far as ever from cracking the defences at Wallerscheid, Higgins decided to try to exploit the little gap in the wire. Soon after dark, an 11-man patrol, guided by one of the men who had helped forge the gap the night before and equipped with a sound-powered telephone, moved through the gap. Around 9:30 p.m., the patrol leader whispered into the telephone. The patrol had surrounded a pillbox, and the Germans seemed unaware that anything was going on. That was all Higgins needed. Within minutes, first one company, then another, was plodding single file, following a band of white tape through the gap in the wire. When another battalion quickly followed, the assault began. The men moved swiftly, blowing the doors of pillboxes with explosive charges, killing or capturing the occupants, prodding sleepy Germans from their foxholes, and capturing 77 in one sweep at the customs house. With Wallerscheid at last in hand, a second regiment, the 38th Infantry, was soon moving forward to help exploit the breach. Elsewhere on the Ardennes front, in the final hours before the Germans were to doff their cloak of deception, all remained relatively quiet, but there were a few last-minute indications that something untoward might be stirring. Late on the 15th, the 4th and 106th Divisions each took 2 prisoners, all of whom stated that they had been told a big attack was coming. Yet 2 were deserters, who said they put little store by what they were told, for they had been promised big things before, and nothing happened. Another impressed his interrogators, but he was so heavily sedated because of wounds that detailed questioning had to be delayed. The 4th, an ethnic Pole, was eager to talk. Interrogated at a regimental headquarters, he said the Germans would attack sometime between December 16th and Christmas in a large-scale offensive, employing searchlights against the clouds to simulate moonlight. But the 106th Division's G2, Lieutenant Colonel Robert P. Stout, delayed reporting that information to the 8th Corps until he could talk personally with the prisoner. For several nights, outposts of the 106th Division had been reporting the noise of tracked vehicles, and on the 15th, Colonel Stout noted that the night before there had been the sound of vehicles all along the front after dark vehicles, barking dogs, motors. A prisoner, Stout added, had said that soldiers who come under the category of Volkslister III, one of the categories of Volksdeutsch, had been withdrawn from the front, but Stout made no effort to read significance into the information. A few miles to the south, outposts of the 28th Infantry Division reported that there appeared to be new and more disciplined troops opposing the division. The soldiers had fresh uniforms, including overcoats, and outside the pillboxes there was much saluting and double timing of guards. A few more miles to the south, the G2 of the 4th Infantry Division, Lieutenant Colonel Harry F. Hansen, told his commander, Major and General Raymond O. Barton, that there were large enemy formations in Bitburg. Although Barton had no thought of a big enemy offensive, he did assume that the Germans might stage a large raid, possibly to seize General Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg City. With that in mind, he sent Hansen to talk with General Seibert, but Seibert discounted the idea. Barton nevertheless ordered all men who were in rest centres farther back than regimental headquarters to return to their units, and on the 15th he assembled his regimental commanders to discuss counterattack plans. On both the 14th and 15th, worried civilians from villages and towns near the Auer River began to turn up in the town of Diekirch, several miles back. The Germans were up to something, said the civilians, though they knew not what. Do not worry, Americans from a counterintelligence corps detachment in Diekirch told them, Jerry will never come back. Unconvinced, the civilians either continued to make their way farther from the front or looked up friends and relatives with whom to stay in Diekirch. Around midnight on the 14th, in response to the information imparted by Elise Dele, a patrol from the 28th Division's 109th Infantry crossed the Our River at Vianden and crept warily up the high ground beyond. The men investigated one pillbox after another, all of which the Germans had long occupied, but they found not a man in any of them. What did that mean? On the 28th Division's North Wing that night, PFC, John B. Allard, a 19-year-old member of Company F, 112th Infantry, volunteered for a patrol also mustered in response to the information from Elise Dell. Having recently learned that his twin brother in another regiment of the division was missing and presumed dead, Allard had made a point of becoming a more active participant in combat patrol activities. Led by First Lieutenant Donald Nicky, the 12-man patrol slipped past German outposts across the Auer from the village of Uren, surrounded a pillbox, and seized it without a fight. While 2 men escorted 20 prisoners to the rear, the others stayed in the pillbox all the next day, while watching with concern as one German formation after another arrived and settled down in nearby woods. When night came on the 15th, Allard and other members of the patrol started back, but in every direction they came upon German troops, backtracked, then tried again. In the end, they decided to brave it, and in the darkness walked straight through a bivouac where Germans were sleeping in 2-man tents. In some of the tents, candles were glowing. After wading the icy Auer, Allard and the others reported what they had seen to their company commanders, but as they headed for their cellars, Dawn of December 16th was only a few hours off. In late afternoon of December 15th, a farmer named Nicholas Manderfeld left the village of Afst in the Losheim Gap to walk a little over half a mile along a snow-covered trail leading to the settlement of Almuthen. One of only 10 farmers whom the Americans had allowed to stay in Afst to care for the beets, as the locals called their pigs and cattle, Manderfeld's home was in Almuthen, but neither Americans nor Germans occupied that little settlement. Manderfeld wanted to check his house to see if all was well. Manderfeld was almost there when 3 German soldiers emerged from behind it, their machine pistols at the ready. One with binoculars around his neck demanded to know what Manderfeld was doing there. Accepting his explanation, they asked what he knew about the American positions. There were a few Americans in Afst, he said, and maybe about 40 in the next village of Kruinkel. Tomorrow, said the soldier with the binoculars, the heavies will start firing again. We will begin the final offensive. By the day after tomorrow, we will be in Liège. In 4 days, Antwerp will be ours. That night, after Manderfeld returned to Afst and was sitting by the stove in the house where he and all the other men were staying, he told his friends what had happened, but nobody believed him. Klaus Manderfeld always was a great one for tall stories. Had Nicholas Manderfeld spoken to the American soldiers in Afst, he might have found a more receptive audience, for the Americans were indeed concerned. The night before, the pattern of enemy behavior had abruptly changed. For long weeks the enemy had appeared to be nervous at night, firing flares and occasionally letting go with a burst from a machine gun or a burp gun. But the night before, there had been not a single flare, and the darkness was eerily silent. So, too, an accustomed parade of putt-putting V-1 buzz bombs passing overhead, en route toward Lee and GE and Antwerp, came to an end. It was the same on the night of the 15th, as 2D Lieutenant Max L. Crawford led an 8-man patrol from Troop C, 18th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, to set up an ambush in Almuthen and try to grab a prisoner. At first, the men circled the cluster of farmhouses, attached barns, and manure piles at a distance. Then, hearing nothing suspicious, they moved to a trail junction across from one of the houses. While 3 men took up positions across the trail from the house at an open shed filled with hay, others deployed closer to the trail junction, and Lieutenant Crawford and CPL John Bannister took cover alongside the attached barn. From inside the house, the two heard low voices and a muffled cough. The patrol had been in position only a short time when a group of about 30 Germans, some pulling a sled loaded with something, and all talking unconcernedly, approached the trail junction. According to Crawford's instructions, the men were not to fire if badly outnumbered, but when several of the Germans began to walk toward the hayshed, PV Richard King, armed with a Thompson submachine gun, considered that he had no choice. The Germans were almost on top of him as he fired. Considering that the little patrol did not have the chance of a snowflake in hell, Crawford's second-in-command, Sergeant David Herzog, yelled to take off. Most of the men made it, scrambling back to a rendezvous point previously agreed upon, but the Germans captured 1 man and were so close to Crawford and Bannister that they dared not move. For more than 2 hours they flattened themselves against the side of the barn while soldiers passed in and out of the house, sometimes so near it seemed to Crawford and Bannister they could have reached out and touched them. It was close to midnight before they dared try to escape, and however carefully they set their feet down in the snow, it seemed as if they were moving like elephants, and that the loud crunching noises would surely give them away. At long last, they were far enough from the house to make a run for it. Getting back to Afst close to 1 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant Crawford reported to the squadron's S2 what had happened. No patrol, said Crawford, had ever run into that much enemy activity in Almuthen. That same night of December 15th, at the southern terminus of the Skyline Drive in Diekirch, a glamorous German-born film star, Marlene Dietrich, heading a USO troop, performed to the raucous applause of hundreds of GIs. She went to bed as soon as possible after the performance, for she had to get up early the next morning to travel north to the sector of the 99th Infantry Division, where she was to make informal appearances at several regimental rest camps close behind the front. Within the Eifel on December 15th, German intelligence officers took a last look at the American side of the line. The only possible trouble spot appeared to be in the extreme north near Monschau, where on the 13th, an apparently small-scale American attack had begun. That might pose problems for the northernmost unit in the offensive, the 272d Volksgrenadier Division, which had been hit by the northern prong of the American attack. The other division that was to attack at Monschau, the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, had just arrived in an assembly area for the jump-off and was thus unaffected by the American attack. Otherwise, the American front appeared much the same as it had for some days, the 4th, 28th, and 99th Divisions, and the recently arrived 106th Division, which German intelligence had quickly identified. The 2D Division presumably had moved to a reserve position, and thus would probably have to be reckoned with at some point during the offensive, but not right away. Possibly because the 2D Division had removed all unit markings from its vehicles and all of its distinctive big Indian head shoulder patches before beginning its attack, and possibly too, because 3 battalions of the 99th Division had also been involved in the attack. The Germans had failed to discern the presence of the 2D Division at Wallerscheid. They still expected to encounter in that sector only the thinly spread 99th Division. At most, the Germans believed the Americans had about 370 tanks in the entire Ardennes, and they felt fairly sure that the 12th Army Group had no major reserves. Yet from agents, they had learned that the 82D and 101st Airborne Divisions had assembled in northern France, where they were presumably resting after a long stay in defensive positions in the Netherlands, following participation in the Allied airborne operation in September. The bars in Reims and surrounding towns were filled at night with rowdy paratroopers. In assembly areas close behind the front that night, commanders read out a message from Field Marshal von Rundstedt and endorsements from Field Marshal Model and the appropriate army commander to their men. Von Rundstedt's message said, "Soldiers of the West Front, your great hour has arrived. Large attacking armies have started against the Anglo-Americans. I do not have to tell you anything more than that. You feel it yourself. We gamble everything. You carry with you the holy obligation to give everything to achieve things beyond human possibilities for our fatherland and our Führer." At von Rundstedt's headquarters in Ziegenberg Castle, the keeper of the OB West War Diary made a final entry for the day at midnight. "Tomorrow brings the beginning of a new chapter in the campaign in the West.